Now that you understand some of the underlying principles of good encounter-based story world design, I can show you my super-duper, one-size-fits-all, step-by-step procedure for creating story worlds. You probably shouldn't attempt to cook up something completely new and original in your first try. Even I wasn't so ambitious. I base my work on the Arthurian legends, although I took considerable liberty with them, producing something unlike anything I know in the Arthurian literature. But do not go for any of the big-time movies that most people have seen. First, that will make your work a cliché. Second, you'll be creating expectations in your audience that you cannot possibly meet. Third, you'll be too tightly constrained by the parameters of that movie. You don't want to find something that you can interactivize. You're not looking for a good plot because interactive story worlds can't have a full plot. You want to find a dramatically rich world, something you can expand and fill out with additional material. Here are some stories that I think would make good foundations for story worlds. Note that extended soap operas are prominent on this list. That's because soap operas throw lots of characters together in all sorts of complicated ways. You might find this book useful. In it, Pulte lists 36 basic situations that are used in almost all stories. These are Pulte's 36 situations. They are a bit dated. For example, number 27, dishonor of a loved one. I mean, like, "Thou hast insulted my operating system. Prepare to die." Here are some links to the book. Remember, you need a story world that has lots of potential for variety. You want a rich, complex environment that can throw up lots of different challenges. Basing a story world on, say, Hemingway's story, The Old Man and the Sea, is rather like making a movie entitled Lost in a Cave Without a Flashlight. One useful ploy is the classic journey story, in which the protagonist travels from place to place, each place presenting an interesting new experience. Examples of this are The Odyssey, Don Quixote, Gulliver's Travels, Huckleberry Finn, Alice in Wonderland, and The Wizard of Oz. Note that 4 of these 6 stories have the protagonist traveling through strange and wonderful territories. On to step 2. Decide what your point is. I must first warn you that a great many designers are driven by what I call technological opportunism. For them, the computer is not a medium of expression. It's a powerful toy that can perform any trick they can imagine, and they are eager to see what clever tricks they can program the computer to carry out. If this is your motivation, then go away. If you have something to say to the world, something you think is important and needs to be said, then you've come to the right place. Interactive storytelling is a powerful medium for expressing your truth about the human condition. This is one of the major differences between games and stories. Games don't have a point. They're just fun. Games are like candy. It's a fun food, but it is nutritionally pointless. Here's another difference between games and stories, and you must understand this difference. Games are entertainment, not art. Entertainment makes people smile. Art makes them think. Now, some stories, especially action movies, bodice ripper books, horror movies, and teen romance movies, are not art. But some stories are among the greatest works of art in human history. Here's a third point of differentiation. Entertainment is made for money. Art comes from the heart. If you don't have something that you really need to say to the world, then you're not ready to make art. Okay, once you've decided what it is that you want to say to the world, you must next define your story world. At this point, you'll run into another one of the unconscious prejudices that is part of the game's Weltanschauung. Many years ago, I gave a lecture at the Game Developers Conference in which I explained that a good game must be closed and complete. The simplest manifestation of this is that there are usually edges on most maps in games, or, regardless of how long you play, you never have to take a bathroom break, at least not in the game. Or very few war games have civilians running into the line of fire. Or air combat games never have any tornadoes. This requirement for closure arises from the need to keep the user interface simple. But encounter-based story worlds need not be closed and can address gigantic worlds that leave much unexplained because such story worlds rely on natural language, which suffers from no such exceptions. Okay, now you've decided upon the general outlines of your story world. Your next task is to start filling it in with details that will give you plenty of room to write lots of interesting story worlds. Now, don't waste your time trying to write detailed specifications. You're going to be changing it anyway as you develop it. Instead, think of yourself as a bird soaring over your story world, watching the people who live there and the daily routines that shape their lives. For example, one day whilst working on my Arthurian story world, Le Morte d'Arthur, it occurred to me that the houses those people lived in were rather flimsy affairs that would need frequent repairs. This allowed me to set up an encounter in which Arthur witnesses some of the workers repairing a house and accidentally has mud splashed onto him. A good basis for a dramatically revealing set of choices. For Le Morte d'Arthur, I researched the entire world in which my protagonist lived. What they ate, the houses they lived in, the clothes they wore, everything about the world in which they lived. This is important. You need that large story world in order to provide you with the opportunities for encounters that explore the player-protagonist's character. Now it's time to define the challenge of the story world. What kind of behavior should the player-protagonist demonstrate in order to realize your artistic intentions? How will the player-protagonist meet the goals you set for them? In Le Morte d'Arthur, the challenge was to live a life that would create a noble story that would live through the ages. The challenge should never be obvious. It should not be something directly or immediately perceivable in your encounters. It should not be something so obvious as winning versus losing, or being a good guy versus being a bad guy. For example, you should not give the player a choice between helping a starving orphan child and kicking him. That's too blatant. The challenges should always be more adult, requiring serious moral and social judgment, and sometimes difficult trade-offs. Look closely at the dilemmas that characters in good stories face. Let those be your guide. At this point, I must warn you about a difficulty arising from something called social intelligence. This is the ability to interpret another person's behavior and anticipate their likely reactions to one's own behavior. You really can't create much of a story about the human condition if you don't understand the human condition. Here's the bad news. Most young males lack any social intelligence. It's partly a matter of upbringing. Little girls play with dolls and little boys play with dinosaurs. This problem is especially severe with male technical people. I'll be making a third video in this series explaining how you can sharpen your social intelligence. Step 5. Define multiple endings. A story world needs multiple endings, and not just different endings, but different kinds of endings. Here's where you dump the game's Weltanschauung that games are either won or lost. In the game's Weltanschauung, there are only two possible endings to a game. You win or you lose. More sophisticated games have point systems that grant you victory or defeat, or something in between. But the basic concept is still a bipolar one: win or lose, victory or defeat, good or bad. Storytelling seldom has such simple endings. Because stories are multidimensional in structure, they have endings that span a range of possibilities. Sure, the good guys won in Lord of the Rings, but along the way, they lost Boromir, Halida, Hama, and Theoden. You should practice this by taking some stories you know well and coming up with alternate endings that would still have been dramatically compelling. Now, I chose these examples for simplicity of pictorial representation, but it's possible to come up with more complex and more powerful endings. One last shot. Step 6. Quantify the challenge. You must now decide on the numbers, the state variables, that best define the nature of the challenge. The central concepts of your story world are expressed in its state variables. These are the factors that determine the outcome of the story. The story acts as a kind of personality test that throws challenges at the player protagonist that force them to make hard choices. It is entirely possible to build a good story world in which the player protagonist must die to dramatically complete the story. These are the state variables that I used in Le Morte d'Arthur. The first 3 determine whether you win or lose the final battle. The 4th determines whether you are given the option to refuse to even fight the battle. A useful concept from engineering is the figure of merit. It's the combination of state variables that together define the overall quality or merit of whatever you're considering. You must create the algorithm that combines these state variables in a manner that expresses your artistic purpose. I suggest that you confine yourself to just 3 state variables and a linear equation for combining them into a figure of merit. This may seem simplistic, but later on, when you're trying to tune the system to function well, that simplicity will permit you to get the tuning job done with a minimum of hair pulling. Now we come to the biggest job of all. Writing the encounters is a long, slow process. Nobody can grind out a few hundred encounters in a few weeks. Remember, use your entire story world to cook up encounters. Create characters from the story world who can challenge the player protagonist. Spread the work out. You can't do this in bulk. Ideas will dribble into your mind at random times. Figure on writing maybe 1 encounter per day. You'll have to write some strictly expository encounters to help the player protagonist understand the context of the story world. These will mostly be presented early in the sequence of encounters and are easy to write, so you should get started by writing some of these. They'll all have just a single option for the player protagonist, some variation of okay, but you should try to put some variety and color into these. Or wow, or golly gee, or what do you know, or ain't that the cat's pajamas? Obviously, you'll need to introduce your characters to the player protagonist. Now here's a basic rule of writing. When you introduce a character, do not simply describe their personality. Instead, show them doing something that tells the player protagonist about their personality. In the early encounters, you'll want to give the player protagonist few options without much dramatic significance. After all, the player protagonist doesn't know much about the story world or its characters, so keep the choices bland and safe. Don't give the player protagonist difficult decisions to make until they've had a chance to learn enough to make informed decisions. And don't give them simple right or wrong decisions. Be sure that a reasonable person might choose any of the options you offer. The options you offer the player protagonist should be closely associated with your state variables, making it easy to write the algorithms for your options. Be patient. You'll probably be writing encounters right up until the day you publish. Don't try to force the process. If ideas for encounters don't come naturally, there's no point in trying to force them out. How many encounters does a good story world need? I'm not sure. L'Amour d'Arthur has over 350 encounters, and some people complain that it was too long. Even so, I think that more encounters, good encounters, would improve it. Next, you'll need to create your Million Monkeys testing system. The Million Monkeys code reflects the old idea that a million monkeys with a million typewriters could, in a million years, write a Shakespeare play. The basic idea is to feed lots of random behavior to the story world and record the results. This provides you with a basis for evaluating the performance of the player protagonist. Think of it as something like a teacher grading on the curve. Obviously, a good player protagonist should be able to do a lot better than a monkey, right? Here's my JavaScript code in which one monkey plays through one instance of the story world. The trick that makes it so short is that the three key methods are all nicely modular, so permit input by either the human player protagonist or the random monkey. And here's the first half of the code for calculating the results of the monkey's work. It merely accumulates the sums required for calculation of means and standard deviations. Here's the second half. It calculates the mean and standard deviation for each of the state variables. It assumes that the statistical results fit a normal distribution. Then it sends the results to the console. Now that you have some million monkey data, the next step is to figure out what it means. At this point, I want to emphasize the importance of understanding simple statistical analysis. If you're not familiar with this stuff, then you'd better familiarize yourself. It's really not that hard. We have the standard bell curve called a normal distribution, and mathematics tells us that you need to be at least 2 standard deviations above the mean in order to be in the top 5%. So you calculate these values to get an idea of what numbers you should use to evaluate the player protagonist's performance. For example, the monkeys got a mean value for the state variable bg of 22.7 and a standard deviation of 6.3. Any score above 35.3 is better than what 95% of the monkeys got. This is a great score and deserves to be treated as exceptional. But if the score falls below 29.0, then the player protagonist didn't do much better than the monkeys. There is a nasty problem that can arise if the distribution of results does not fit a normal distribution. That is, the monkey results might not fit a bell curve. You could end up with a monkey distribution looking like this if there's a limit on the maximum possible score. If you end up with a distribution that deviates significantly from the normal distribution, you'll just have to make your own table of performance values by inverting the distribution. I'm sorry to say I don't have time to explain how to do that now. This explanation of how to create an encounter-based story world has been, shall we say, excessively concise, but there's even more to explain. In the third video in this series, I'll explain what you must learn in order to create art.